Hey guys, real quick before we start the video, I want to point out that for some reason that I have not been able to isolate, the audio quality of this is really tinny and hollow and weird. I'm sorry about that. I don't know why it happened, just somehow the file got corrupted and oh, shoot. It may not be obvious, but it actually takes me sometimes hours to record this stuff, so rather than re-record it and make this come out probably several days later than I would have anticipated, I'm just gonna put in this quick little mention. I hope that it's not too awful though, you guys, and I hope that it's listenable. Again, sorry. Hope you enjoy it though. Last time I left you guys with a bit of information, and a very pressing question that I had related to that information. That question was this: given that humans as a species at large are K-selected, that is, that it takes a very long period of time for us to gestate and raise our offspring to sexual maturity, and as such we tend to select long-term partners to increase the chances of that success in the production of an efficacious and functional offspring, who in turn become members of our social pack and provide for that pack, why then would we see an increase in the propensity for Western women to seek out low-value migrant males who possess few of the traits that we typically see draw women to men, specifically higher education, higher occupational outcomes, wealth, age, and overall status, in addition to potentially unrelated physical traits such as height? To start answering these questions, let's first take a look at some of the things that women find sexually attractive in men. As I mentioned in the previous video, research on twins indicated that even monozygotic twins would not always choose the same types of partners, meaning that mate selection is not inherently genetic. What Zeitish, Verweij, Heath, and Martin 2011 found in their study of twins and partner selection was that similarities, such as religiosity, as well as relationships with one's parents, were a greater determining factor of who we ended up with than mere genetics. Since we know that women tend to be attracted, again, to older, more established men, let's go a little deeper and first examine some of the other factors of female attraction which might help to explain this trend that I observed happening across Europe. Rudman and Hepman 2003 examined the romantic attractiveness women held towards fantastical male figures, white knights and heroes, and found that they often had little to do with women's external expression of their interest in those same ideas. That is, even women who believe strongly in feminism may implicitly react positively to romantic portrayals of males as strong and gallant. Using an implicit associations test, the researchers were able to assess how women reacted to these fantasy roles, both explicitly based on their responses to a survey about them, and implicitly based on the expediency of their responses to these roles. I have criticized the fuck in previous videos out of implicit associations tests, specifically in that expediency of response may not actually indicate bias, but rather familiarity. Now you could say that is bias because that's a cognitive heuristic. It doesn't mean that, for example, when we talk about race and implicit associations test, that you don't like black people because it takes a white person longer to respond to their face, but rather that they're just kind of more used to seeing white faces. That would explain some of the expediency. And keep that in mind because I think that that will tie in far later. Now I should point out that this type of implicit proclivity toward traditional, what you might want to say are really K-oriented male roles of the knight in shining armor, the leader, and the protector figure, were also associated with other aspects of female behavior and belief, specifically with lower expectations for high earnings, less emphasis on academic achievement, and lower emphasis on career outcomes. Tendencies of what some scholars refer to as hyperfemininity, a term I find inaccurate and somewhat offensive, as it would imply that behaviors outside of those are the norm of femininity, when again, from a biological standpoint, the mere temporal investment in child rearing would indicate a lower general proclivity towards leadership and other forms of dominant behavior from women. But alas, yes, women who tend to seek out males as leaders and providers, both explicitly and implicitly, also tended to be less occupation or education oriented, as again was indicated by Rudman and Hepman in their analysis of what they called the glass slipper effect. Two feminist authors, I might add, oh boy, boy, I love when I can take feminist research and use it to apply to things that I'm talking about, huh? Because in fact, what the authors were trying to look at here, and what they were concerned with, was to indicate that this aspect of hyperfemininity actually hinders women's desire to succeed when they are attracted to chivalrous personality traits. That is, women who value or seek out white knight type of men also tend to be less likely to seek out high educational or occupational aspirations, whereas women who were less attracted to these traits tended to have higher occupational and educational goals. Again, these romanticized male types don't seem to describe the typical migrant, now do they? The typical migrant who tends to be uneducated, often fully illiterate, not only in the language of the country they are migrating to, but very frequently in their own language. They also tend to possess few higher job prospects. What I mean by this is that women with hyperfeminine proclivities would seem to not prefer that type of partner, or at least not in aggregate. In contrast to the expectation of the researchers in this glass slipper research, a trend we'll come to see as more and more common would be that women's desire to be successful had really no impact on how they were perceived as attractive to prospective male partners, while male success did have an impact on their attractiveness to women. What the researchers found was some interesting pieces of data. For example, that men who held romantic and chivalrous fantasies were also more likely to wish to be group leaders. That is, that men who were in some way attracted to knightly stories or romantic depictions of masculinity were also more interested in being leaders with higher social, educational, and occupational aspirations. What I did find curious in this particular piece of research, which included 3 different studies, and although it was only present in one of the 3 experiments conducted, and as such is potentially a misnomer, is that women's implicit feelings about romantic fantasies were, once at least, negatively associated with their explicit romantic fantasies. Again, I must caution in not overestimating the reach of this finding, as it only appeared once across the 3 studies, but I think it may make some sense, in that often we may find that we have implicit desires that our cognitive minds feel cannot be expressed for some reason or another, perhaps because it's not socially acceptable. Specifically, women raised in a Western, feminist-leaning society may on some implicit level still desire the chivalrous white knight qualities in a male partner, but as a result of their education and socialization, state outwardly a distaste towards such fantasies. What the research did indicate consistently across all 3 evaluations conducted was that women who had a positive response to male fantastic roles as heroes or protectors also had lower self-expectations or evaluations in terms of job or educational outcomes. Although not assessed, we could take a guess that given these women were less educationally and occupationally oriented, that the women who were implicitly drawn towards these fantastic male roles were essentially probably more likely to have aspirations towards motherhood and child rearing. That's just a guess, as once again, the data did not assess these goals. The women that we would, in contrast, more likely to seek out these migrants would be the non-hyper-feminine women with a greater interest in education and occupations, because again, these migrants don't seem to fit the roles that were assessed. And again, more educational and occupation orientation, well, that tends to describe more liberal women. We find consistently that both liberal men and women tend to be more educated, for example. And although you could quickly argue that that's a chicken or an egg type argument, in that does education make one more liberal, or does being more liberal make one seek out an education? The data tend to be fairly clear and consistent that the higher your education, the more likely you are to lean to the left. Certainly, it was a media talking point around the 2016 US election that the only people who voted for Trump, this gal, are mental midgets. Although occupational outcomes may not be so related with liberalism, given the number of bullshit, worthless women's studies degrees which don't financially amount to a hill of beans that get passed out. My point is that what this research indicates is that women who hold more traditionally feminine fantasies of knights in shining armor are less likely to be in the same group as these highly educated, potentially also higher earning women, at least in their own self-perceptions of being high earning. Again, mind you all fam, that this is coming from the mouth of a supposedly highly educated woman. Once again, I want to mention the twin studies, in that people tend to hook up with those they have shit in common with, which includes shared parental backgrounds. In other words, if you're a woman from a 2-parent household with traditional Western Christian beliefs, you're more likely to marry a man from a similar background and similar beliefs. And given the glass slipper research, if you're a woman who finds traditional male fantasy fantasy roles attractive, well, we can extend that research to suggest that you would be more likely to seek out a man who also finds those roles attractive, and as such is also more successful, more prone toward leadership, a more K-selected male. In contrast, a woman who does not find these roles particularly attractive, either implicitly or explicitly, I'm not sure, would therefore be less likely to seek out men who find those traits attractive as well, or who possess those traits. What instead, then, may these typically liberal, more educated, more often successful women seek out in a man? We are then left with a massive question, which is, what then does drive these likely predominantly liberal women who do not fantasize or who do not appreciate more traditional male romantic partners into the arms of Syrian rebels and ISIS? Well, I think I can answer that question fairly succinctly, and that answer is this: dominance. This may seem fairly obvious to some, maybe most, but the data need be explicated. Kostrich et al. 1975 found that male speakers who exhibited submissive traits were significantly less popular than male speakers who exhibited dominant traits in small group discussions. Interestingly enough, for feminist scholars who have spent decades desperately trying to prove how oppressed strong women are, this same study from 1975, found that aggressive behavior did not negatively affect or impact the popularity of female speakers. I mean, holy shit, if it did, I wouldn't have a single fucking viewer, would I? Since I'm pretty aggressive and I curse like a goddamn sailor. Anyway, aggressive or dominant behaviors were positively associated with perceptions of male popularity across both males and females. Let's look more specifically at the effects of dominant behavior on female perceptions of sexual attraction towards men then. Sadala, Kenrick, and Verscher, 1987, found consistently that women rated males who were even just described as dominant to be more sexually attractive than males who were described as submissive. This study similarly reflected the findings of Kostrich over a decade earlier, in that the dominance of women did not affect male sexual attraction toward them. Interestingly, what the same research also indicated is that dominance and other related aspects, such as domineering behavior and aggressiveness, were negatively associated with likability. That is, women tend to find dominant men sexually attractive, even based on a description of dominance alone, but would simultaneously express a distaste for those individuals on the level of liking. From here we can draw a number of conclusions and associations. Let's begin, however, with one of the previously mentioned studies on female romantic fantasies, the Rudman and Hepman one, namely that sometimes what women proclaim publicly to find attractive is not in alignment with their heuristic attraction. As such, we are likely to find that males who act overtly dominant are perceived by women both as unlikable, yet simultaneously more sexually attractive. Seems bizarre, right? In social science, sometimes you come across what I like to call the no shit factor, in that this is something we often see and which is often described as, quote, common knowledge, yet needs to be explained with the supporting data. And what's the no shit takeaway from the dominance research? Simply put, women want to fuck bad boys, but they also don't really like or appreciate aggressiveness or domineering behavior, hence why we so often find anecdotes of women hooking up with men that they want to reform, with bad boys. They find the dominance behaviors sexually attractive, but also want to change them because they don't like those behaviors. To change the man expressing those behaviors into a more well-fit, well, perhaps more case-selected long-term partner, Let's just keep going down this rabbit hole to understand it more thoroughly though, shall we? There is significant data not just in the few that I covered above, but in the description as well, and maybe I'll throw up a couple here, because holy fucking shit, it's kind of not up to debate at this point, that when males act submissive, they are less liked both by other males and by females alike, and are perceived as less sexually attractive. Submissive behavior also increases female perception that a male is a homosexual, which doesn't really affect liking, but certainly does affect sexual attraction. Again, a no shit finding. After all, they would be thinking they're barking up the wrong tree. See McCreary 1994. Further, we have seen that dominant behavior, while attractive from a sexual standpoint, doesn't preclude a man from seeming like an asshole. Actually, quite to the contrary. Sexual attraction seems to be on some level negatively related to liking from women. Once again, if you ignore the anecdotal no shits, this seems like a paradox, right? Well, here's some more research. In In 1993, Ikes described that women and men who enact aggressive or excessive masculine and feminine behaviors independently, men being overtly masculine and women being overtly feminine, with masculine behaviors being described as dominance, aggression, and domineering, with female behaviors being described as nurturance or caring. Well, in those situations where you have a hyper-masculine man and a hyper-feminine woman, if you want to use those terms, it ended up that they tended to have more difficulties in their relationships with each other. That is, Ikes, as well as others such as Antill 1983 and Green and Kenrick 1994, found that more, quote, androgynous and even more feminine behavior from men in the long term was particularly associated with happier, committed relationships. This is logical, again, when we return to the K-selected nature of the human species. Men who displayed strong, dominant tendencies at first are, yes, sexually attractive, but again, women don't like it. They want the reform. They don't want the dominance long term. Men require caring, more, quote, androgynous, even more feminine traits to be the best possible providers, leaders, and fathers to their families. Men without these empathetic tendencies do not represent the typical ideal male for a female to choose as a partner because they lack the fatherly and nurturing aspects preferred for the extensive involvement in offspring rearing necessary for the maximization of a successful human development. As such, I think I may have just unpacked the first piece of this puzzle as to why these young, probably feminist, liberal women are seeking out ISIS members and readily moving to Syria in the middle of a fucking war zone, only to weirdly change their mind a few months later. Because these men are highly dominant, yet they are men from an actual patriarchy, and do not often possess the more androgynous or caring tendencies that, evolutionarily speaking, women have sought out in partners. But they are competing with Western men in a sexual marketplace, where those men have been taught that those dominant behaviors are sexist and misogynist and terrible. As such, it really isn't a surprise, is it? We have these liberal women, likely less concerned with family formation and less concerned with finding a gallant white knight, ending up in relationships with the definition of the patriarchy that they likely think they are fighting against, as they end up in the most traditional type of relationship possible, with a man high in dominance and low in more feminine, nurturing behaviors. As always, I can only speak in aggregates and averages. I would never deign to ascribe any of this to an individual. These are merely the generalized findings and should be interpreted as such, generalizations. What then do we find in general then? As I said, less happy long-term relationships between men and women when the men do not enact more feminine, more caring, more nurturing behaviors. And why do I say that such behaviors are probably a rarity in these failed relationships between Western women who are seemingly giving up on the emasculated, non-dominant males of the West for these migrants? Well, because they fucking admit it, my dudes. In Tunisia, Morocco, and Iraq, for example, over 90% of Muslims believe that a wife must always obey her husband. Across the Muslim world, from South Asia or North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, on average about 70% of Muslims desire Sharia law to rule their nations, which entails making women legally subjugate to men, and which supports the stoning of women often who have committed adultery, which in many of these same countries is a case where a woman has sex with a man who is not her husband, any case, and that includes and means cases of rape are equivalated to consensual sex. You want to talk about a patriarchy, feminists? There's your goddamn patriarchy. And here's a bit of a dangerous big red pill, I guess, that I'm going to merely suggest. I'm not even going to advocate, and probably to the detriment of my own channel. There is research that certainly isn't been done anymore, but research that was being questioned, that suggested that many of these same cultures are more R-selected. Now, as a species, we are all K-selected, but research that suggested that some of these cultures were more R-selected than European or Asian cultures, despite originating in Africa, which, to quote my boy, since I really can't figure him out, Emmanuel Macron, is starving from civilizational differences, including having too many kids while already fucking starving. So why is this happening? Is it a racial difference? Is it a cultural difference? What is going on, and why are these women so seemingly attracted to migrants who possess so little apparent value? Dominance, sure, that seems to make sense, but is it possible that these women who don't seem to be as drawn toward K-selected males given their lack of attraction towards traditional male roles as leaders and providers, that is, maybe more of an attraction to an R-selected culture? I've already got some comments on this, that the alt-right just likes to bring up RK selection to make a racial argument. So you know what? Let's go there. Let's go full fucking steam, and let's address the potential racial argument. This report from Miller 1993 summarizes the general research when it comes to potential racial differences between humans in terms of R or K selection, and you can certainly argue with his assertions, indicates that Negroids, and that is the forensic anthropological term for African haplogroups, you Mongoloids, which by the way is the similarly scientific classification for those of Asian haplogroups, tend to be more R-selected, meaning that they as a group or culture or race at large and on average, and fucking trust me, on the next How to Science video it's gonna be a lot of discussion of averages, tend to be more R-selected, meaning they tend to prefer mass reproductive tendencies as a method of brute force survival rather than more in-depth, more involved child-rearing tendencies, despite the low availability of resources in Africa, which typically would define more K-selected groups or species. But again, holy shit, I'm not saying Africans are a different species and miscegenation is bestiality or some shit. I'm saying that it's merely possible for there to be a racial component to this attraction of liberal, educated women towards men who are themselves potentially more R-selected, as these women appear to be, or at least not attracted to the typically K-selected male ideals. But be aware, and one last fucking time, none of this is a determinant. Nothing about this refers to any one person. These are only general theories. And by the way, I do tend to disagree with Miller, but not in that it is impossible for race to play a role, but rather just that it's not lining up with the question that I asked. The research I've already covered seems to indicate that similarities in traits, such as shared beliefs and a positive relationship with one's family, are the most important factors in mate selection, not genetics. Yet still, I believe the debate or question need be raised, if for no other reason other than to provide a multitude of possible answers or outlets for this question that I posed. My point is that although I cannot find data that would suggest more R-selected behavior is endemic from people in the Middle East, there is some scant, and I say definitely scant, evidence to at least support the theory that people from African cultures may have a tendency towards more R-selected behavior, which includes lesser concern for the raising of a single child, preferring instead a brute force maximization of reproduction, with the caring behaviors that completely unrelated research in the social sciences has indicated leads to the most happy and productive marriages being less important to those societies, potentially. But hang on, because that racial argument certainly, again, seems at odds with the statistics that I provided earlier on the highly structured patriarchal nature of Middle Eastern relationships under Islam. It actually makes way more sense to consider Islamic culture as a highly K-selected, not R-selected culture, with a great deal of emphasis placed upon the role of the female as the nurturer and the male as the provider or protector. I need to point this out before I end this section as well, that Edward Miller, the guy I just cited, is a highly controversial figure and a professor of economics, not evolutionary social psychology, not psychology, not anthropology, and certainly not biology. He's an economist. So take his assertion that there are racial differences in the human proclivity towards more or less R or K selection with a massive grain of salt. He is without a doubt a conservative with some hard stances on women and homosexuality in addition to race. However, the primary source of Miller's review is John Rushton, 1988, who pretty much wrote the book on RK selection in humans, and who has been accused of being a racist, at least as much as Charles Murray has, and yet, again in a single YouTube video, even a two-parter, only trying to dissect one single question, the question I posed in the opening, that is, why the fuck are women fucking migrants and running off to Syria with them? Getting into this entire debate of racial differences across the human species is just too much. It will come eventually, just not in this video. But this, my friends, is why I love research. You're asking questions, you're seeking answers, you're using existing data to try and find an answer to said question, and updating your beliefs or changing your beliefs and changing your assessment as new data are indicated. As such, I implore you all, if you find any error in my logic or reasoning or citations in this video, please fucking tell me. And once again, take Miller's assertion regarding North African R selection with a massive critical eye. But given some of the questions I I have raised, which are in contrast and contrary to Miller's theory, namely that Islam supports a patriarchal, seemingly more K-selected society, in addition to those twin studies research which indicates shared values, beliefs, and familial background are a greater predictor of mate selection than genetics, this racial argument would not seem to well answer my question of why Western women are doing this. In fact, the racial answer seems to do the exact opposite. As such, I suggest we drop the concept of a racially oriented difference being responsible for this behavior. My point is, while you could perhaps make the argument for a more racially oriented difference between Western and non-Western cultures, the data are sparse, it's mostly just theoretical, and they're actually in contradiction to the extensive research that indicates that genetics have very little to do with who we choose as long-term romantic partners and with our long-term romantic outcomes. Instead, let us focus our attention on traits, since traits seem to be the thing that matter the most. Specifically, let's focus on the traits that would describe factors we may associate with K selection, what's called the K factor, as it is described by Figueredo, Vasquez, Bumbrach, and Schneider 2004, and further in Figueredo et al. 2005, who analyzed multiple variables in an attempt to describe K-selected traits in humans, including mating effort, that is, fucking without the intention for reproduction, which would be reproductive effort, risk-taking attitudes, Machiavellianism, adult attachment to romantic partners, childhood attachment to a father figure, be they biological or non-biological, and parental investment. The K-factor identified in the model fit was positively associated with childhood attachment to a biological father figure and adult romantic partner attachment, while it was negatively associated with those other traits, Machiavellianism, childhood attachment to a non-biological father figure, mating effort, and risk-taking, and it accounted for 96% of the variance in the model. That is, when you plugged in this K-factor, it explained a large amount, if not almost all of the differences in individual partner selection. And unlike race, which again doesn't appear to be a good predictor, or at least one that we can reasonably assign to anything like that level of credit, this K-factor does appear to be heritable, but in a slightly different way than race is heritable. By that I mean, what Figueredo and his colleagues have identified across their numerous studies is that a couple that possess these K-factor traits are likely to pass them on to their children, perhaps not in a purely genetic matter, but also through method of transference of values by upbringing. Again, this outlook would seem to explain the twin studies, which found that things like religiosity and parental involvement again to be better predictive variables of mate selection than genetics alone. These traits appear to be 68% heritable from parent to child. That is, parents who aren't risk takers and are committed are likely to have children who are also not risk takers, and people who become involved in long-term committed relationships as adults. The issue then becomes a complex tangle of to what extent are these traits genetic and to what extent are they environmental? Are they a product of upbringing? And at some level, when you begin to muse about the long-term cultural norms, such as the value of monogamous adult relationships, as is typically or has traditionally been promoted in Western civilization, at one point does environment and the outbreeding of certain traits by isolation from the mating and gene pool essentially become indecipherable from one another. We again arrive at a chicken or an egg argument. The point appears to be, however, is that if you have a good relationship with your biological father and your parents remain committed, you are more likely to pass on similar traits, and given we seek mates who share traits with us, such as these, it quickly becomes evident that this produces a cycle of K-selected individuals who possess this K-factor, who are more focused on the raising of children than mass reproduction, than just fucking. With that in mind, let's get back to the topic at hand, and here's the answer I believe that my analysis has come to in explication of the question that was the impetus of these videos. Western women are fucking ISIS members, running off to Syria and marrying them, importing the brothers of terrorists and wanting to fuck migrant children for a number of reasons. Both because these migrants come from cultures where dominant masculinity is the norm, and because we have fundamentally changed our own culture's proclivity towards K-selection. Over the last 60 years, we have seen a massive increase in divorce rates, including an enormous uptick in the number of single-parent, often single-mother households. You can blame it on feminism, you can blame it on cultural Marxism, you can blame it on the fucking reptile people for all I care, but the data are beyond question. In the 1960s, only about 5 to 10% at maximum, based on what you're looking at, of Americans were divorced, and similar rates of divorce were mirrored across Europe. Today, however, divorce and single parenthood rates have skyrocketed very far into the double digits, and while, as I indicated, we cannot isolate to what extent the heritability of the K factor is environmental and at what extent is genetic, in fact, it may be pointless to do so much more than muse on it, at least right now, given the total complexities of the issue, we do find that the K factor affects mate selection as a trait, much as do other traits and similarities, with a partner before factors such as race or genetics. And more importantly, given we know that this K factor is a trait which seems to be largely heritable, that means a decrease in individuals with positive relationships with their father figure, their biological father figure, an increase in risk-taking behaviors or mating effort as a trait are less likely thereby to pass on the K factor to any children they in turn produce. We're starting to see a pattern here. Feminism and cultural Marxism espouse the supposed benefits of women becoming strong and independent. Since the cultural and sexual revolution of the 1960s, wherein these ideas became the norm as perpetuated by university professors and academics within the ivory tower, we have seen an increase in divorce rates and an increase in single parenthood. Similarly, feminist theory, again celebrating the sexual independence of women, also frequently idealizes free sexuality, which for the first time in human history, around that same time frame of the 1960s, with the introduction of female oral contraceptives, allowed women to take risks sexually and engage in more mating effort by all but eliminating the chances of unwanted pregnancy. As such, what did we see occur? It's actually quite a logical result. There's an increase in women's risk-taking behavior because a portion of that risk has been mitigated. No more pregnancy. As such, there's also an increase in mating effort rather than reproductive effort because of the availability of contraceptives. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with contraceptives, I'm just talking about a trend. Also, we see less or no attachment to partners since, after all, feminism has told us we don't need no man. In fact, needing a man is now portrayed as weak, as wrong. And yes, as a result, you also see an increase in the lack of partner attachment. More and more single-parent households, specifically more single-mother households. Given this trend began with the boomers in the 1960s, millennials now are 2 entire degrees removed from the beginning of it, resulting in the lower likelihood of positive relationships with their biological father figures as well. Those are pretty much all of the individual traits that went into the K factor, aren't they? Put it all together, and not only have I probably answered my question, but I think I'm starting to paint a somewhat terrifying picture of the systematic destruction of the K factor and maybe Western civilization at large. Holy shit. As such, women who come out of the system are more likely to lack that said K factor. And in contrast, what do we get? They tend to be more R-selected, riddled with daddy issues and willing to fuck around and avoid commitment. And what do we have in contrast to them? Well, a bunch of migrants coming from a strong, dominant, patriarchal society wherein women even lack the choice or the opportunity for such behaviors, where dedication to the father is paramount, where risk-taking behavior among women, risk-taking behavior as extreme as walking alone outside unaccompanied, is grounds for a proper stoning.
I ain't wearing these beards. Why aren't women allowed to go to stonings, Mum? It's written, that's why. Beard, madam.
Oh, Luke, I haven't got time to go to no stonings. He's not well again.
Where a woman isn't even capable of divorcing her husband under almost any circumstance, and should he beat her half to death, well, she better hope that he does go full Aloha snack bar if she wishes to not remain committed to him. That is a culture that is dominant, that is full of this K factor. And even if we do seek out birds of a feather in our romantic partnerships, well, then we have our dominance factor, don't we? That dominance is sexually attractive first and foremost. Yeah, remember back? Dominance is sexually attractive, and women without strong white knight chivalrous fantasies, which are associated with lower educational aspirations, which are in turn negatively associated with left-leaning individuals who hold left-leaning ideas, such as perhaps that limitless Middle Eastern and North African Muslim migration is a net benefit to our society since, diversity is our strength. Yeah, they may lack some aversion to men who do not meet the leadership or protector criteria. We've seen that. Despite the fact that this is in contrast to the typically case-selected nature of the human race at large, and while I don't totally disagree with Rushton that race has a potential to be a factor, as I've said a couple couple times now. It's likely a small one compared to these hereditary traits outside of race, but overall, yes, we are a more K-selected species than rabbits, for instance. Although again, once more, it seems illogical to choose these highly dominant, unlikable even partners, who without the more androgynous, caring, more nurturing behaviors would seemingly make for poor long-term partners in happy relationships for the purpose of successful reproduction and child rearing. That dominant behavior that they express is certainly not something we see very often from Western men these days. It's haram to our society. It will get you labeled an evil sexist. What that means is that despite the fact that there is no obvious evolutionary reason for women to choose these typically uneducated and illiterate migrants, sometimes outright terrorists, their immediate display of dominance towards these women, who have become systematically more R-selected over the last 60 years with the explosion of cultural Marxist thought, where in short-term attraction, which dominance and overtly masculine behavior would seem to be in concordance with, where that short-term attraction is paramount, and where parental outcomes are less important than just fucking, well then obviously, that short-term attraction becomes tantamount. It becomes key. It's all that really matters to them, is it not? There is a dearth of dominant behavior coming from Western men, and who can blame them when they are publicly castigated for daring to do so much as sit quietly in the same room as a woman? Without the initial attraction, often sparked by displays of dominance, which is now, again, all that matters given as we have slowly begun to eliminate that important K-factor trait that would suggest, from an evolutionary standard, the importance of long-term partnership and safety. What is there to draw these R-selected women to Western men? What does a Western man have to offer a woman whose interests lie in educational and occupational outcomes, not in reproduction? The dominance of such a K-selected culture, which we likely should not associate with race, as Rushton and Miller may have suggested, but rather with traits, as Figueredo et al. Have done in their examination of RK selection in humans, is that the ideology followed by these migrants outright states that women are subservient, women are lesser, a woman is literally half of a man, and as such, dominant masculine behavior may still draw in these R-selected women, despite having little to nothing in common, and despite likely being poor providers for children, because these women are behaving in an R-selected manner, having had the K-factor essentially bred out of their families and cultures. Well then, is it any question? Is it any question why these men are being preferred over Western men? It also certainly explains why these relationships don't tend to last very long, if this is accurate, as I believe I have provided some evidence for and in support of, considering that these women are anticipating just another fling, just another fuck, but they end up getting shipped to Syria and being forced to escape after having surely the most massive "I've made a huge mistake" moment of their lives.
I made a huge mistake.
I began this entire investigation simply confused as to why these likely liberal feminist women would be attracted to men who represent not only no evolutionary positives, but why they would choose men from arguably the most patriarchal society on Earth. And I think I provided some evidence to explain why that might be the case. From the rejection of the traditional K-selected romantic ideals such as chivalry in women more likely to be liberal because they're more educated, to the short-term burst of sexual attraction that is given off by dominant males from a culture that views women as second class, whereas Western men are not allowed to express any sort of dominance. It does sort of seem to explain this phenomena, yeah? Again, I could very likely be wrong, but I believe I have provided an answer, or a number of answers, that may serve to address the question itself. Tell me in the comments if I'm retarded and if you disagree, but not before you check the description and read some of the research I've cited for yourself. Or don't. I wouldn't deny a good shitpost. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.